Welcome to the Food Startups Podcast.
I heard today they was going to talk about some coconuts.
Some coconuts? What's them coconuts? That's some crazy talk.
Danny, today we are on our 30th episode, so it's kind of a big step for us, isn't it?
We're on our 30th episode. That's crazy talk. What you talking about, 30th?
I reckon we can go as far as 50.
50? If I have 50 episodes, I'd be a star.
Well, we're almost there.
Matt, all right. So, we're at episode number 30, and we've got a really exciting topic to talk about. I know you're in the U.S. hustling hard, and you're taking time out of your schedule to be with us today. So, do we want to get right to it and talk about the coconut wars?
Yeah, let's talk about the coconut wars. I think this will be in line with all the other episodes and maybe even higher in the takeaways because we have read a lot. We even did research this time for our 30th episode. It's time to get serious. And listeners, if you go to foodstarterspodcast.com/coconut, you will find the list of links. And we think if you only had time to read one article and not the 15 articles and interviews that we read, I would choose the one from the New York Times.
Yeah, the New York Times has had a kind of a great, I don't even know what this means, but a great expose on these two companies that have been the leaders of the coconut water industry. And so I definitely recommend you guys checking it out. It was an article that I immediately sent off to a few people after I read it because it was just so packed with cool information. Today, what we're going to talk about is the coconut wars tell the stories of two companies that have battled for the coconut water space in the United States, but have also created an entire category that is now approaching $1 billion in revenue a year. And that came from nowhere back in 2004. So we want to see, how do they do it? What did they do? What can we do as food entrepreneurs, as food lovers, to continue to grow out our passions and create billion-dollar industries out of them? So really quickly, Matt, I'm going to run through this kind of short outline that we have. Just a few topics we're going to touch on, okay? We're going to talk about resourcefulness. We're going to talk about sales in the retail market. So tough to grow out sales. We're going to talk about testing. We're going to talk about something that we call immigrant to national market. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about funding and then how sometimes actually having the deepest pockets isn't always better. So, Matt, I hope I've got some great lessons for small businesses in the food space today, and we're excited to share them. So why don't you kick us off?
Well, yeah, and taking a step back, just a few years ago, coconut water was a very, very small market in the U.S., almost non-existent, and in 2013, it was around $400 million. And it's projected to go as high as a $1 billion a year industry. So this is something that grew very, very fast, which makes it very fascinating because there's tons of us who are choosing various niches and they're hoping to get some type of growth. Now, very few are going to grow as fast as the coconut, but it's good to analyze one so you know the ones that made it, what they did, and how they got there, how they got lucky, etc. And I would say the first thing that came to mind was resourcefulness. Now, VitaCoco, they put $100,000 into inventory for their first launch, and they were unaware of the FDA regulations to import coconut water. They just thought it could just show up at a port and they'd be able to sell it. Turns out they were wrong. As we talked about the FDA guidelines in one of our old podcasts, there are a few things that you need to follow. And to be fair, 10 years ago, Danny and I were not in the food business, and we were unaware of these things ourselves, and it could have been different. But based on what we know today, they didn't follow the FDA food facility registration. So what happens? They cannot get this coconut water into the U.S., and they ended up going to bars in the Bahamas and selling it door to door there.
Yep, and just to clarify, so they dropped it off in the Bahamas. Now I'm guessing that they had probably a 40-foot container they were importing of coconut water and a bunch of money that they had saved up. Or I know that one of the founders had a previous successful exit at a different company. but you didn't know what the rules were, which many of us don't. Actually, you're a pretty resourceful guy, and you actually also do your homework with those rules, and they did not. So just to kind of bring them into line, VitaCoco was pretty smart, but they were also making some rookie mistakes. But they dropped off their container in the Bahamas and started selling it there to get rid of inventory, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, and VitaCoco in the war, right now, they are winning by a lot, and Zico is number 2. Now, we're going to try to do a full-scale analysis at the end of the podcast. Danny, talk about a very unique adjustment that VitaCoco made early on.
Well, sure. VitaCoco was a drink that came from Brazil. It was sourced in Brazil. And folks in New York, there was coconut water there before. There is a brand called Goya, which makes just about everything for the Latino market in the United States as far as consumer packaged goods. And they have been producing coconut water. When I was growing up in New York City, I could find Goya coconut water for 99 cents just a few blocks away from my house. And I live in a big Colombian neighborhood, actually. So it was there. And so VitaCoco targeted bodega owners at first when they started to grow their retail sales. And they were in more of an ethnic brand that had an ethnic feel. But they soon started to figure out that VitaCoco, that their brand and that coconut water itself could be something that's more functional. They could have an appeal for having potassium, for providing hydration. And so what they did was they figured out through testing and then through pivoting that they could be a brand that's different from what they initially had targeted. So that was huge. It's a huge takeaway because a lot of time food entrepreneurs, I think they really fall in love with their babies. They fall in love with what they're creating. And sometimes they need to change because they're not going to be the ones that propel the market forward. It's going to be the customers that provide the sales. So VitaCoco made that adjustment, and it turned out to be a very, very good play for them.
So, yeah, to me, it's really inspiring because they proved that you can take what is quote unquote, and I'm sure there's a better way to put this, but an ethnic brand, a brand that was primarily for Americans that associate themselves with an additional culture, and make it mainstream.
Yeah, and things evolve in every single industry. Look at the coconut water industry. And let's take a look at VitaCoco because we really looked hard at that company and how they've become successful. In 2006, they had retail sales of $2 million. In 2007, $4 million. Now they're valued at $665 million. Companies change over that time and industries change over that time. So you got to be flexible throughout your growth. If you're growing quickly, you're going to have to make tons of adjustments. And the most important adjustment actually might be your core product. Now, sometimes the key to success is maintaining your product and maintaining your standards and your values. That's extraordinarily important. But you always have to be open to change and be listening for what's out there. So I think it's a big takeaway, Matt.
Yeah. And to me, it's exciting. Now, VitaCoco and Zico, neither company knew about the other, but they ended up launching at about the same time. But they both thought when they launched that we're going to be the only people doing this, launching this style of coconut water without preservatives, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, I think that's really inspirational because it shows that you don't have to enter a traditional industry. You can take an ethnic food or an exotic superfood, whatever it is, and create your own market.
Absolutely. And listen, I mean, it's going to be hard one way or another, but to see the phenomenal growth in the coconut water industry shows you that it is possible. And I think that's big encouragement because a lot of the time when you're a growing company in the food or the beverage industry, you feel a little bit lost out there. And so we want to say that looking at the coconut water industry kind of helps us benchmark what are some things that we can accomplish in our own respective companies. Now, Matt, let's move on to sales, okay? Sales is kind of the lifeblood of any company, and especially in the food and even more so the beverage industry. You have to have strong sales and really grow them out. So what can we talk about with sales? What did we see with these coconut water companies that made them successful? What are the weird things that they did? How did they get to where they are today?
Well, so first off, in sales, VitaCoco gets an amazing salesman, like the type of personality you need, someone that's not afraid to be rejected and yelled at, was willing to work at night. The store owner's going to be there counting his cash, and he's going to go store to store and say, take a case and offer these deals. And also selling to a distributor. They got a fairly large distributor, but it wasn't nearly as big as the distributor of Zico. VitaCoco got a distributor where they had connections, but at the same time, VitaCoco would be the biggest brand. Zico got a huge distributor where they were one of the smaller brands, so they had less priority and less incentive at the distribution company to sell Zico.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's super, super, super important. Sometimes it's really worth it to work with small companies because you're going to be a bigger fish in a small pond. You're going to get more attention. You're going to be the all-star. You're not going to be on the sidelines. And that's really, really important. It's really great to kind of see and understand how that works because a lot of folks, they think, well, listen, this is going to be a slightly different analogy, but some folks think, well, listen, I can get my food products into Whole Foods. I'm set. I'm gold. But sometimes it's the neighborhood stores that sell more than the Whole Foods. Sometimes you're able to create much more influence because of the fact that the neighborhood, the store owner is going to be able to vouch for your brand, get you some contacts, and really pay it forward because of the fact that you're making him successful. It's really important to kind of note there, just kind of when you're choosing, when you find success, who you choose as far as your partners. I want to move on to another topic and something that we talked about before, and it's something that we call immigrant to national markets. Okay, so the national market in the United States before 2004 did not have a large coconut water presence. Goya was out there, and there wasn't a ton of other presence. And coconut water was this drink that was like water, but I remember reading that when the CEO of VitaCoco, Michael Kerben, walked into his first bodega and got his first sale, that the store owner said that this coconut water tasted like sock water. So there's nothing out there that's similar to coconut water on the market, certainly because nothing else tastes like sock water, if you could think about it. And what happened was that actually turns out to be good for coconut water because that turned out to be good for these small startups because of the fact that Pepsi and Coca-Cola, they couldn't just add another flavor to a drink and outcompete them. They couldn't just add, let's say they were in the orange soda space and orange soda hadn't existed at that point. Coca-Cola couldn't have just thought of a Coca-Cola water recipe. They were in such a different space, this coconut water, that it was successful because the bigger guys couldn't penetrate the market that easily. So what they ended up doing is trying to take stakes in actually the successful coconut water companies. The coconut water company Zico being one of them, the other company One out of Brazil, which Pepsi Cola has a large stake in.
Yeah, and it's amazing that you think of a large or a very growing and burgeoning drink industry, bottled drink industry, and neither Pepsi or Coca-Cola is number one. That's amazing.
Man, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, well, vitamin water was the same way until they were bought out. And there are a handful of companies that have been like that in the beverage and food space over the years, but a lot of the time they face a lot of pressure for the big companies. And so one thing Matt and I want to talk about is funding. Now, funding is hugely important in every single food and beverage company, just because a lot of the time you're just going to need to have cash on hand to fulfill large orders, to create your factory that you need to be able to ship your product. And so one thing that we saw is just that VitaCoco, which is now the 60% market leader in the industry, they had a company that had been an investor in vitamin water that took a 20% stake in their company for $2 million back in 2007. And then just a little while ago, they had another company, Red Bull Japan, take a 25% stake in their company for over $160 million. So we can see just how much that valuation has grown over the years. We can also see that, this is very selective. We know that a few of these companies that have led in the coconut water space, they've turned down big offers from the big companies. And so it's really interesting to just kind of see that something progresses the way that it does and at what point these companies take on funding. So in 2004, being bootstrapped, in 2007, cashing out $2 million to be able to continue growing. And then 2014, maybe for the founders to cash out a little bit, but also to inject some money into the company, you can raise over $160 million.
Yeah, so if you want to go against the big boys, it's not easy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and let's go to the marketing claims and the war. Now, this is really interesting. I'm reading from the article in the New York Times that VitaCoco initially stated that its product would, quote, eliminate kidney stones, improve your skin, increase virility, basically any upside that had ever been asserted in countries where coconut water is beloved. But all that magical boasting ended when VitaCoco was sued in 2011, accused for misleading claims. So they were very, very aggressive trying to sell this product. You could argue that they went way above the legal lines to get people interested and gain market share. But at the time, that's what happened in the industry. And it's very interesting because aggressive marketing claims, that's only a small piece of what was happening, because there was a war that was going on. VitaCoco and Zico are fighting for space. So sales reps from each company, Zico sales reps might go into the store and take the price tags off all of the VitaCoco products, put it in a shopping cart, throw it to the back of the store. Tons and tons of fighting. So while coconut water has the perception of a pretty healthy product, people associate health with vitality and peace. This was a bitter capitalistic fight.
Yeah, absolutely. When we see these companies, we see Rihanna and Jessica Alba on the cover of magazines drinking coconut water. There's definitely a battlefield, and the company's trying to advance the front line, and it's tough, man. It's tough. It's pretty interesting to see, though, because you get an idea of how kind of cutthroat these industries can be.
Yeah, and really, at this point, VitaCoco is far and away out on top, to the point where they have actually lamented that they don't have an arms race as they did before with Zico. They're saying, man, we wish Zico was closer because we need a strong number two, like Monster versus Red Bull, to push the industry. It helps add credibility and excitement to the industry and helps push it forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just a clarification. Now, Matt, we're focusing a little bit more on the startup phase of these companies. And we leave out a little bit about just kind of how these companies have matured. And without a doubt, what we have read about, what we've heard, is that VitaCoco has emerged ahead in the past few years, largely because Zico was actually bought out by Coca-Cola, and they actually lost a little bit of their brand identity. So going back to kind of Ketchum and the podcast that we previously recorded, we see that brand identity and connecting with your brand is so important. But it was definitely a war, and you're definitely close. And there was this raging battlefield where now we see that this company is pulled away. VitaCoco was pulled away so much. And some of it's actually happened because the big companies messed everything up. So an interesting note to see how things have turned out when the big companies get kind of involved in the companies that have done so well on their own.
So trying to sum all this up, we talked about the arms race. We talked about the very aggressive guerrilla marketing. We talked about funding. We talked about distribution. And we talked about how sometimes the biggest companies don't always win. What conclusions can we make for our food startups listeners?
Well, listen, the first thing that comes to mind is that you're going to grow companies store by store by being smart, by saving money, and slowly building out something that works. You've got to be really close in. You've got to be in the trenches to actually make headway. I think that's the first thing that comes to mind. And there are some other points we talked about, like funding for me is a huge one, just understanding just how these companies were funded. But to me, got to be in the trenches, Matt.
Got to be in the trenches. So I'd say another thing is finding a niche. You have to find a category where you have some space to compete.
Absolutely. It's hugely, these guys created this industry, but it was really small back then. And now if I wanted to start a coconut water company with the same values as VitaCoco, I wouldn't be able to do it, right?
Yeah, that's right. They had the first mover advantage.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Excellent. Now, listen, man, what's the next coconut water? What are some of the other categories that we can share with our listeners that have been kind of popping up on our radars that have some pretty good prospects?
Well, one really interesting one is maple water. And it's not just water with maple syrup, but the water that goes through maple trees. And it only comes through at certain times of the year. I guess it's a sap. I'm not an expert on maple water, but I assume it's the sap that flows from the trees that's usually turned into syrup. But you can just take the water and drink it straight up, and it's very, very new in terms of health claims, just like coconut water was 10 years ago.
Yeah, and from what I've heard, maple water makes a pretty compelling argument that, listen, this is stuff that feeds the trees. So how good is it going to be feeding people? And in many ways, that's something that intuitively makes sense, especially for the generation, in this generation right now where lifestyle and fitness and health is just so important. And we see that coconut water definitely leveraged that. Coconut water was a functional brand because of the fact that it was about hydration. It was about feeling good. It was about actually, your skin feeling better, no hangovers. Now it's becoming a lifestyle brand. Zico recently became more of a lifestyle brand, always moving in the directions of the trends, not going against them. Maple water is definitely a great example of that.
Yeah, and it's really cool that we're talking about maple water today, because one thing that I really appreciate from the research going into this episode is that Danny, you or I, or some of our listeners or friends, anybody, could be involved in an industry that was like coconut water in 2004. So you think that these sales pitches for just a box, just a case of 12 units of whatever you're selling, it may not add up to much profit there, but all these little actions can have a huge effect, and all these efforts you're making can pay off tenfold if your industry takes a similar growth strategy to coconut water.
Absolutely. You got to start the snowball somewhere, Matt, and without that initial effort, you ain't going nowhere. Listeners, I hope you guys had a great time learning about the coconut water industry, listening to some of the stories that we had, listening to our ridiculous accents early on. One clarification, actually, one mistake that I made was I mentioned Red Bull Japan, but actually it's Red Bull China. It took a 25% stake in VitaCoco earlier this year. And hope you guys had a good time listening, and see you guys soon.
And as always, if you have any questions or comments, find us online at foodstartupspodcast.com.